This week we talk Zimbabwe, and my guest is Dr. Kenneth Mtata, the Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Council of Churches. And my question is, where was the Church of Zimbabwe all the Mugabe years? This is James Talk Africa.
From Cape Town to Cairo and from Mogadishu to Dakar, this is Chim's Talk Africa. And now here's your host, Chim Onyibilanma.
Welcome there, viewers, to this week's episode of Chim's Talk Africa. I'm your host, Chim Onyebilama, and this week we'll be going to Zimbabwe, like I said earlier on, and we'll be looking at what the church can learn from what happened there. But before we go into the interview, I want to make, as usual, some comments on the news. I've been flying a lot Ethiopian Airways in recent times, and what caught my attention some months back was just the number of traffic, the amount of traffic going through the Addis Ababa airport. And I did a little bit of research, and what I found that really encouraged me.
If you look at the plans of the Ethiopian government, they want to make Ethiopia a manufacturing hub for East Africa. And so as they plan on how they're going to grow over the next 5 to 10 years, there's a big focus on developing manufacturing capability. And if they succeed with the kind of low-cost electricity that they have here, the large population, and the links that they have to the surrounding countries, yes, there is a good chance that Ethiopia can be a manufacturing hub for East Africa.
You see, normally in Africa, overpopulation is normally seen as a disadvantage to economic development. And at 100 million people, Ethiopia is the second largest nation in Africa. But the leaders of Ethiopia, through a well-planned economic strategy, is turning this seemingly disadvantage into an advantage. Learning from countries in Asia like China and Vietnam, Ethiopia is gradually positioning itself to be the biggest manufacturing hub in Africa and even other parts of the world. That is really exciting because, you see, this is forward thinking, and this is kudos to the leaders in Ethiopia, and we will definitely be staying with that news. There is something else I do want to bring out in Ethiopia because, as you know, this year, following the strikes and all the protests in Oroma, part of Ethiopia, there was a change in leadership. The present Prime Minister is Mr. Abiy Ahmed. What I want to point out is just the misinformations that happen with our big social media and quick technology and the information that bombards us from left to right. When he was sworn in a few months ago, I wanted to find out what he believed. And I saw this website. Can you imagine? I looked at it and it looked possible because his name was Abiy Ahmed, and of course he could be the first Muslim leader there. But when I checked with my friends on the ground, they were shocked because they went and said, though this man has a Muslim background with his father, yet he's not a Muslim. When I passed through Ethiopia, I asked around, and even the Muslims were telling me that everybody in Ethiopia knows that this man is a Protestant. My friends who have reliable sources in government there claim that this man is a born-again Christian. Can you imagine the disparity between this headline saying, here is the first Muslim prime minister in Ethiopia and the reality on the ground? That's why I'm just bringing this up, that we need to be very careful about fake news, especially we Christians. We are quick to forward things to many other people without verifying it. Just imagine that I didn't have all the contacts I had to check this out. But then this is the route to take when it comes to all kinds of sensational news. Don't forward what you can't verify. If we do that, we would help not to be part of the bad news in Africa. The second country I want to comment on this evening is what is going on in Burundi.
An estimated 4.5 million Burundians took part in Thursday's referendum to make a decision on whether their country will be under a new law or not.
There was a referendum that was voted a while back, some weeks ago, which was to amend the constitution in such a way that a president's term in office can be increased from 5 years to 7 years, and a president will be allowed to sit 2 consecutive terms in office. But added to this was also an amendment that allowed the present president, Mr. Pierre Nkurunziza, to stand for election when his term finishes, that is in 2020, even though he has already had 3 terms in office. There's a provision for him to be able to stand for election and potentially lead up till 2034. That got a lot of people wangling and talking. For me, especially because unlike Mr. Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia, who hasn't openly come to claim that he's a born-again Christian, even though my sources tell me he is, this man, Mr. Pierre Nkurunziza, openly proclaims his faith, says he's born again. And indeed, I give it to him. He has done a lot since he entered in 2005 to bring a kind of calm into this war-torn Burundi. But that's not enough, in my opinion, to allow the abuse of democracy and for him to perpetually be there. I was relieved when he came out afterwards to say he is giving his word. He doesn't plan to stand for election come 2020 when the new president is supposed to be sworn into office. So that's good news. That is fine, and I love the fact that he would say this, and let's pray that this stays like that, because we as Christians in politics, those who are leaders in politics, we should be showing the way. We should not just be born-again Christians in the word we say. We should be acting it, being the ones that strengthen the fibers of democracy and accountability. And thank God that he came out with that. That's my comment for this week. We'll go to our interview now. I'll be talking to Dr. Kenneth Mtata from Zimbabwe. Don't go away. We'll be right back with that interesting interview. Welcome there, viewers, to this segment of your show. Like I said in the beginning, today we are focusing on Zimbabwe, and we are asking, what was the church doing all the years of Mugabe, and what is the church doing now? I don't think there's a better church leader to be talking to than our guest today. Our guest today is Dr. Kenneth Mtata. Dr. Kenneth, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Dr. Kenneth is the Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, the ZCC. He's a man who is passionate about nation building and has been in the forefront of the church engagement with the government and with society. Dr. Kenneth, where was the church all the 30-something years of Mugabe?
The church was both present and absent. The last 37 years, we saw the church playing a very important role initially when the church participated in the negotiations, the initial negotiations for Zimbabwe's independence at Lancaster House. The church was playing a role behind the scenes to enable the Patriotic Front, the different African political parties, to negotiate and find a peaceful solution to the war that had been raging from the 1960s.
Yeah.
And for this reason, we could say the church was present initially. But after independence in the 1980s, the church felt that it had finished its work and therefore allowed the Africans to run the country after colonialism. I think this is where things started to go wrong, because you know that soon after independence, there was a genocide that took place in the western part of the country and in Midlands. And the church was sort of absent during that time.
Silent about it.
Yes. And I think these were the signs that the churches had sort of relinquished or renegated on its responsibility to continue holding this new government responsible. And we think that if the church had continued the task it had started in the 1970s and continued in the 1980s, I think we would have seen some kind of a relationship with checks and balances between the church and the new independent African state.
Would you say former President Mugabe was really, he had a good intention from the beginning? It's just that things went wrong? Or what's your view? Was it a catastrophe, or was it just a good plan that went bad?
Yes, I think you'd remember that soon after independence, President Mugabe announced that Zimbabwe was going through a reconciliation process. And I think the whole world embraced him. We know that even England bestowed on him one of the prestigious recognitions of knighthood. This was a very rare recognition for an African leader because of his call for reconciliation, that there was no more separation between blacks and whites, and that the conflicts of the past were going to be forgiven. And this is the reason why many people thought Zimbabwe was going to be a great nation. But what we saw from the beginning in the early 1980s, we realized that there was no concrete recognition of difference, because we had ZANU-PF and we have PF ZAPU. And we realized that the recognition that it is possible to have different political parties in one independent African country was not fully embraced. And I think those were the telltale signs that this may not go well. And then, of course, we saw what happened when thousands of people were killed as a result of the claim that they were dissidents in the Western and Midlands part of the country.
So obviously, your view, it was something that was good that went bad.
I believe it was something that was good that went bad, but I also suspect that it was a sense of insecurity. The idea of living within diversity, I think, was something that was not fully cultivated.
You need a good sense of security to be able to absorb and live in diversity.
Yes, and I think this is one characteristic of leadership that still has to be fully developed in our African context.
Even in the church.
Including the church.
Because many times leaders are insecure in the church when there are various shades and when they're not controlling everything.
Yes, but you know, the church is actually the best place where diversity can be lived. Because when the gift of the Spirit came down, the Spirit gave different gifts. So the possibility of diversity and unity is something that the church already has from its beginning. And if the church was going to be a catalyst for a unified nation of Zimbabwe, it was going to give this gift that it is possible to be diverse but still be a united country.
So from your analysis, I could see easily that because the church began to withdraw and things started to go the way it went, the church lost its voice. And because it lost its voice at a time when the nation needed such a voice, speaking into that space, because already every form of diversion was being, everybody who was different was being removed. The church could have been the neutral, sensible voice at that critical time. And maybe things wouldn't have gone the way it went.
Yes, I would think that if the church, there were individual voices. We cannot discredit the voices of people like Bishop Pius Ngube,
who kept speaking,
who continued to speak. But if you do not have a unified voice of the church, then it is very easy for these other voices to be labeled renegades or to be labeled as if the church is intruding in politics.
Especially towards the end, there was not a unified voice anymore in the church. I think the church began becoming active towards the end of Mugabe's stay, and I'll let you comment on that. But like I've talked with you before, we started seeing people who were the praise singers. You had a group of people who organized a big gathering in the stadium just some months before President Mugabe fell, just saying, God has said this man is going to, and the wife is going to take over. So what do you say about that?
Yes, and I think this is the crisis of the church. The reason why Jesus Christ prayed that there must be unity among believers was because it is only in unity that the church can speak with power. And what we saw just before the demise of President Mugabe was that you could see that the voices of the church had become so split. What was called the Super Sunday, the Sunday before the then vice president was expelled, one sports stadium was full of people from some churches that were saying that God had anointed the president's wife, that she was likely to be the one who was going to take over, and all the other voices that were dissenting from within ZANU-PF were labeled as something that was contrary to God's will. And this was a sign that I think we're having a problem, because this was not the voice of the whole church, but still they represented the church.
The church, for me, yeah.
And for this reason, we feel that this tag, that there were some people who were sort of ignorant of what it means to be a Christian, I think may not be the right label. This represents one sector of what it means to be the church that endorses the status quo. Because the same people, after the President Mugabe was removed, in the next few weeks, when the new president was being inaugurated, they filled the National Sports Stadium and they were receiving the new president.
Isn't this what happens all across Africa? That we have this inability to speak to power because church leaders just roll over in front of political leaders. They lose their prophetic edge just because of gain.
The biggest challenge I think we have is the church has not understood the idea of power as Jesus Christ has talked about power. And therefore the church, where the church wants to identify with power, the church will compromise all its other values to identify with power. But what we see is that whenever the church tries to continue identifying with power, then the church becomes the legitimator of anyone who is in power. They endorse. And when they do this, then the church loses its prophetic voice. And we hope that this is not what is going to continue in Zimbabwe and indeed in the rest of Africa. Religion, and Christianity in particular, plays a very important role in Africa, and that the church needs to rediscover its own prophetic voice so that the church holds accountable, praises a state when it is doing well, but it also holds the state accountable where it is not doing well.
Essentially, that is our role. And I think you people played a good role just at the time of the crisis. I mean, we watched what was called, if you like, a palace coup. It played out in the media where your military kept saying, this is not a coup, we're just fishing out some bad eggs here, and everybody knew it was a coup, but things were going on behind the stage, and I understand that the church was involved even at that time in trying to make sure that there was peace. Tell us a bit about that.
I think this was interesting presentation of the church, because we said on Super Sunday, the church was filling the stadium, praising the incumbent, praising the incumbent and his wife, but as soon as the transition started to take place, one Catholic father by the name of Father Mkonori was now at the center of things, trying to negotiate between the military and the incumbent. And this was very interesting, a contrast of the church. On one hand, the church is endorsing the status quo. On the other hand, the church is mediating, or midwifering, if you could call it, giving birth to something that was new. And Father Mkonori started to play a very important role of negotiation. But then we, as the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, together with other church organizations, we realized that we needed some people who were going to organize how we were going to engage with this new thing that was emerging. And we organized and brought together civil society. And on the 24th of November, when the new president was being inaugurated, we brought together about 4,000 civil society leaders, including church leaders, to negotiate how we were going to engage with the new government. And so we saw different faces of the church. Within 2 weeks, we saw different faces of the church. But at the end of the day, we think that the church cleansed itself. It presented itself as an institution that can repent and find its new voice.
That's good. We're going to take a break now, Dr. Kenneth, and our dear audience here. Viewers, we're going to take a short break and we're going to come back. And when we come back, we want to see what are the lessons we can learn as a church from what has happened in Zimbabwe. And don't go away. I'm talking with Dr. Kenneth Mtata, who is the Zimbabwe Council of Churches Secretary General. Thank you. Stay tuned.
Do you have any opinions or comments on today's subject or any other issues in your country or around Africa? We would love for you to join the conversation. Please send us your comments by WhatsApp video, voice, or text message to the number on your screen or via Facebook, Twitter, or email. We may be able to include your text, audio, or video comment on a future show.
Welcome back, dear viewers, to the second segment of our interview with Dr. Kenneth Mtata. Dr. Kenneth Mtata is the Zimbabwe Council of Churches Secretary General, and we've been talking about the role the church in Zimbabwe played during the Mugabe years and trying to learn from it. Dr. Mtata, I know this is a subject you're passionate about when it comes to nation building, and I want to ask, what is your view about the role of the church when it comes to speaking to power or engaging government or playing its role in terms of moving the nation forward? In your view, where should the balance be?
As you have said, there is a first group that says, ours, if we are preachers of the gospel, is to prepare people to go to heaven. And for them, people must come in on Sunday, you preach to them, they sing hallelujah, and they have learned what God wants from them, they have repented of their sins, they pray, and they are preparing to go to heaven. They don't want to hear anything about policies about health. They don't want to hear anything about going for elections to vote. They are not interested in understanding what are the political debates. They are not interested in whether the city council comes and collects the beans. They are not interested in anything that they may consider secular.
And carnal.
And carnal. There is another group, a group that says, we are a church, and ours is to recognize all the governments that God has put in place. They quote Romans 13 that a good citizen is one who accepts what God has given as government. So even if the government is unjust, they embrace it. Even if a government is oppressive, they embrace it and they say we must just suffer because God has given us this government. There is a third group, which I would say those are critically engaged. They say if the government is doing good, they praise and support the good work the government is doing. If the government is not doing well, if the government is oppressing its people, they stand as prophets to speak truth to power. And I think this is the kind of church that we are missing in our continent, but also in the rest of the world. This problem is not only in Africa.
It's not just an African
but
problem.
in the rest of the world.
So the church is grappling with what its role is, because I think what some leaders find challenging is, how can I engage the issues without becoming a political voice?
Yes, and I think this is where the issue comes. The first thing is consistency. The church cannot wake up one morning and they start to want to criticize a government which they have never praised.
Yeah.
So if the government is doing well, if the government is doing that which enriches and strengthens people's lives, something that empowers people's lives, the church must speak in support of that. Whenever the government diverts from that which enriches and strengthens life, the church must be consistent in the way it communicates.
And the church needs to fight for the poor.
Exactly.
It needs to fight for the poor. Who will speak for the poor if it's not the church?
Exactly.
But you're saying that speaking out for the poor would not be sharp enough if we've not been commending the powers that be, if we are like silent when they're doing well, and we're not looking out for what they're doing well and speaking it out. Our voice will not be sharp enough when we speak. I will be like the opposition party.
Exactly. But also the church must embody what it says to the state. The church cannot talk about justice in society when it's not just inside. The church cannot talk about democracy in society when its way of structuring itself is autocratic.
And one man is calling every shot.
Exactly. So what the church wants to see in society, it must see in the church. The church cannot speak about a representation of women in government when the church doesn't have representation of women in its own leadership. So the church must speak to the world what it is doing inside itself.
That means we must speak more by what we do and what we are than even our voice. And so that when our voice comes, it's authentic.
Yes.
And we look at the present government in Zimbabwe, and people are saying it's a particular article in New Africa said it's, how did he put it now? It says, old wine in new skin. It's the same people who are wearing new clothes. What's your view?
I think the issue, one thing we know is that there's been a change. Okay. If you have been in a country run by one person for 37 years, and you have people who take over after 37 years, whether these people have worked with this same guy, this is no longer the same. We saw this in Angola. The same people were in government. They took over, but the new government was taking a new direction. I am convinced that we are no longer in the old era. This is something new. They are the same people, some of them, who were running the old government, but they were not decision makers in the full sense of
They
the
didn't
word.
have the power they have now.
Exactly. But if whether we are going to see a major change is going to be seen only in retrospect when they have done their work.
Yeah.
So we cannot judge them simply because they were in the previous government.
So we must give them a chance and give them a space to do what they can do. What are some key lessons, let's say the top 3 lessons you think we learned from the whole thing Zimbabwe has been through as a church that other people can learn from?
I think, Chim, we can already learn something that you are doing this show because you are saying religion is so important in Africa, but we need thinking faith. Faith that thinks, because I think if so many people believe, it is how they believe that can contribute to the rebuilding of this continent. And therefore, the first lesson that I think we will need is that we need to revisit how we reflect on what we believe in. Because I think we can then become critical followers of political leaders so that we contribute to good governance in the continent. I think this is the first. We need to rethink our theology, how we believe, so that what we believe can become a resource for building our continent. The second thing that I think we learn from this is that there is no political leader who must be given all power. All power must be given to God. And
absolute
therefore,
power
there is no absolute power.
absolutely.
Exactly. There is no absolute power for human beings. Absolute power must be given, must be ascribed to God. And only if we remove this idolatry from our politics can we be able to build a continent that is going to thrive.
We need to remove idolatry from our politics. That's a great one. I like that line.
We need to remove idolatry from our politics, but also idolatry from our churches. Because it is this understanding of power in the church that we sometimes see overspill in the politics. And lastly, you have already said it. We need to be driven by our concern for the poor and the vulnerable. If as a nation is measured, its success, it was Nelson Mandela who said this. You will know the progress of a nation by how it takes care of its most vulnerable. And I think we need to build a continent in which we are driven by the needs of those who are on the margins of society.
That's good. That's good. Those are key points. Dear viewers, this is where we're going to land this interview that has been quite engaging with Dr. Mtata, the Secretary General for the Zimbabwe Council of Churches. We've been talking about the Mugabe years and what we can learn, and we've been talking about the role of the church in nation building. Dr. Mtata, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great having you, and we'll be praying for Zimbabwe because we believe, like you do, that the years ahead are going to be great. Thank you, viewers, and thank you to the audience that is here in the studio. God bless you. Welcome back, dear viewers. That was, for me, a very insightful conversation there with Dr. Mtata. I'm sure you will agree because it helps me to have a perspective of what God is doing in Zimbabwe and just have hope for what is to come. Let's keep praying for Zimbabwe. This is where we begin to wrap up our show this week. But before we go, here is a word for you. It's from Luke chapter 9, verse 23. And he said, that's Jesus, said to them all, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. You see, there are 2 types of people who follow Jesus. Even in the Bible, there was the crowd and there are the disciples. And even in our churches today all across Africa, we have a large crowd but few disciples. Yet Jesus is calling his people to this route of discipleship, of being true disciples. He said, if you want to come after him, if you really want to have this relationship with him, it's not about what you will get from him. It's not about using Jesus as a stepping stone to your own success or to your own ambition. Jesus is not here to be used. He's here to be served. He's here to be Lord. He calls us to deny ourselves, to say no to our selfish desire and our ambitions. God is not here to make you a millionaire or make you a billionaire. We're not all called to be millionaires, only a few of us. But God calls us to follow him, to take up a cross, whatever it will mean, whatever it will cost us to obey him and to follow him daily. I'll leave you with that word, and I encourage you to respond to this call of discipleship because this is a big need in Africa. I'm Chim Onyebilama, your host on Chim's Talk Africa. It's been nice having you with us this evening. This is where we draw the curtain on the show. I look forward to having you again with us next week. Same station, same time. Exciting. God bless you.
This program is made possible by the generous financial support of believers just like you, who share our heart to equip the African church to engage the issues facing our continent. Your financial support will help us continue this important work. If you feel led to give to this ministry, please visit our website today.